Our next presenter this morning will involve irrigation timing effects on yield and quality. And for that we have Dr. Glen Ritchie, an associate professor of crop physiology with a joint appointment with Texas A&M AgriLife. Dr. Ritchie is at Texas Tech University. He received a Bachelor of Science degree from Utah State University in crop science. He also received a Master of Science degree at Utah State University in crop science in 2003, and his PhD degree from the University of Georgia in agronomy in 2007. He joined the Texas Tech faculty in 2011. That was a good year to come in and study agricultural crops. 2011, and is currently an associate professor of crop physiology. He holds a joint appointment, as I mentioned, with Texas A&M AgriLife. His responsibilities at Tech include teaching crop physiology, plant-water relations. At the Texas Agricultural Experiment Station, Dr. Ritchie has an active research program examining plant-water relations in cotton and sorghum. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Glen Ritchie this morning.
Well, thank you, Ritchie. Sorry, I'm still getting accustomed to this microphone myself. A couple of things, and I enjoyed the introduction. I like these introductions because they kind of remind me who I am, so that as I get older, I can keep track, and people can kind of point me in the direction I'm supposed to go. As he mentioned, I started on April 1st, 2011, and I came from a humid, semi-humid cotton production system in Georgia here to West Texas, and it was strangely appropriate that I got to cut my teeth on West Texas cotton on April 1st, because 2011 was an extraordinarily dry year, and I was reminded of just what a challenge it is to produce cotton. A couple of other things, as was mentioned, I have a 25% appointment at Texas A&M, and so when Bob said that he got his degree from Texas A&M, 75% of me was unhappy, but 25% of me was happy. It's been a real pleasure for me over the last 7 years to interact with both Bob and with Jim Brodowski, who are both excellent agronomists and excellent irrigation specialists who are up closer to Plainview. And some of the work that I'm going to tell you about today is actually from some work that we piggybacked on Jim's work over there at Halfway. This was some work where he had a really cool system where we had 27 different patterns of irrigation that we were testing, and we got to come in at the end of the season and do autopsies on the plant and see what happened with them. We've been interested in timing and irrigation rate for a long time. I really liked what Bob said about you can't just go about irrigation helter-skelter and expect to, number one, learn anything, and number two, have any idea of what's going to happen. And the thing that I liked with the work that we did here was that we were able to actually test this in a way that we could actually see what happens when you vary the amount of irrigation at any given point during the season. And so we were interested, if we cut off the water completely, or if we cut the water down to 50% early in the season, what effect is that going to have on the overall crop? What's going to happen if we do it at peak bloom? What's going to happen if we do it after peak bloom? And let's see what we can actually do to these plants. Interestingly enough, those of you who've heard me speak before have probably heard me say this. It's interesting. A lot of people ask me, "Did you get into crop science because you love plants?" And the answer is kind of, but I mostly got into crop science because I love to torture plants. And so what you're going to see today is us torturing the plants in a lot of different ways. Sometimes we give them water, sometimes we don't give them water, and watch and see what they tell us here. Interestingly enough, some of them we cut the water off and they got stressed. We cut it off some more and they got more stressed. We cut it off again and they still wouldn't talk. And so I'm going to tell you up front kind of what we found out so that as you look at these slides, you'll be able to keep this in mind. First of all, if you really limit the amount of water that you have early in the season prior to first bloom, the big things you're going to see are you're going to tend to see very short plants, very short internodes. Just visually looking at the plants, they're going to look like they're not happy at all. But if you're able to get water on them during the actual flowering and fruiting portion of the growing season, you tend to get relatively large bowls. You do have some effect on yield, but the effect on yield is relatively small. As you move into the middle of the season, the plants have already done a fair amount of growing at that point. And if you cut off the water, very similar to what Bob said, if these plants are accustomed to having lots of water, they are focused primarily on building infrastructure. They're going to tend to be relatively tall. They're going to have a lot of branches, a lot of leaves. They're gearing up because they're being trained that they are in a high-yield environment. And if you're in a high-yield environment, you don't want to skimp in terms of infrastructure. And then you cut the water off, suddenly they're trying to support all this vegetative biomass, and they start throwing fruit. They start essentially going into this massive stress response where visually looking at it, plants look reasonably good, but you open them up and the fruit's just gone out of them. A lot of times you'll see a little skirt of fruit around the bottom. You'll see this massive region of the plant, depending on when the stress actually kicked in, where the plants have just shed fruit. And then, if you get more rainfall or more water later in the season, sometimes they can do some sort of a recovery toward the end. And then finally, later in the season, again, you're going to have relatively tall plants. At this point in the season, you've got fruit that's a lot of different ages and a lot of different stages that's being affected. And depending on which part of the plant you're on, that fruit's actually going to be affected in different ways. If it's at the top of the plant's probably going to throw it off. If it's in the middle of the plant, you're going to be affecting it right when the fibers are elongating. And if it's at the bottom of the plant, it's going to be affecting it while the fibers are maturing. And so essentially, you've got the opportunity to damage 3 different parts of the plant in 3 different ways. And so there's a lot of work that's been done on irrigation rate. In fact, there are probably 150 different research articles in journals where they talk about irrigation rate on cotton. But it's a lot more difficult to look at timing of precise intervals. And something that was neat about the work that we did with Jim was that not only was it a timing, but it was also we can play around with the rate and timing and see, it's great to know if you cut off the water, this is what it does, but also, what if you have water, just not enough water? And so we really focused on that with this study. This work was done in halfway in 2011 through 2013. I thought it was appropriate to pull this back out because after the 2012 season, I was convinced that we could not get another season like 2011 or 2012, super hot, super dry. And then 2018 rolled along and we're like, well, if in my mind, at least in Lubbock, 2018 probably fell right between about 2011 and 2012 in terms of heat and lack of rainfall. And so to me, this was great because it gave us a chance to look at 2013, which I would consider more of a typical year, 2012, which was a relatively dry, hot year, and then 2011, which was an extremely hot and dry year. This was over at halfway, and there were 3 different irrigation rates. The low was no irrigation during that period of time. The median was 1/8 of an inch a day, and the high was 1/4 of an inch a day. So if we're putting that in terms of potential ET, at least at the middle of the season, that would be about 40 and 80% of potential evapotranspiration. Keeping in mind, if we're early in the season here, the plant's probably not going to need quite that much water. Late in the season, maybe it's not going to need quite that much water anyway. But what we did was we actually used every one of these periods and 3 rates at each of those periods. And so, when we put it all together, that resulted in 27 different possibilities of irrigation patterns there. The only way we were able to do this was that Jim has a leaf pivot at halfway that is variable rate, and he's able to put on different amounts of irrigation throughout here. And so as I go through, you may see some lettering here. I did this just so that we could kind of keep track of, was this an early irrigation treatment, was this a mid-irrigation treatment, was it a late irrigation treatment? As I mentioned, 2011 was real hot and dry, 2012 was relatively hot and dry, and then 2013 was more of a typical situation. I would point out really quick, if you look at the number of heat units here, we had a lot more heat units in 2011, and the least in 2013, and so that's also something to keep in mind. We talk a lot about irrigation, and to some extent, I think we tend to forget that when we're talking about irrigation, we're also talking about other effects that we're having in terms of these plants. Not only is water a limiting factor, but if we over-irrigate, particularly in an environment where we don't have a lot of heat units, you can actually cause a lot of damage to both your yield and your fiber quality, just because the plant's still trying to produce bolls at the top of it, and it's time for it to be shut down. And so that's just something to be aware of as well, that at some point, so what we looked at was boll production and distribution. Here's my stylized version of the cotton plant here. Here is my former graduate student, and what he is doing is box mapping. What we do is we go and harvest a segment of plants, and we pull every single boll off those plants, and we see where it was on the plant. And so the fruit that's produced early in the season is going to go to the bottom of the box, and the fruit that's produced later in the season is going to move up the box. And so you get a very accurate estimate of where the plant is actually producing and retaining fruit over the course of the season. Here's an example of one of the samples that we pulled. We have 1 meter samples. You look at the number of bolls by node, you look at it by fruiting position, and from that you can actually see where the cotton is being produced over the season. As I mentioned, we had 27 different irrigation treatments. If anyone wants to come up and look real close, it's fascinating. But I'm going to get into some of the things that stood out the most to us. Here's a typical, in fact, this was the highest irrigation treatment that we had at halfway. This is a typical boll distribution for a relatively unstressed plant. We weren't over pushing the water here, but we had enough to produce reasonable yields. And typically what you're going to see is you're going to see an increase of boll retention and production up to about node 8 or 9. And then you're going to have a region within the plant where you're retaining most of your fruit. And so you look over here, and we're at about 90% fruit retention in here, all the way up to about 12 or 13. And then it gradually drops off, and depending on the irrigation or the variety, you might go up to the low 20s in terms of nodes. But typically the bulk of your yield is going to be produced right here in the middle of the plant. If you stress a plant mid-season, what you'll tend to see on this is this sudden fruit shed where the amount of fruit immediately drop off, and if you were to walk out into the field during the middle of the season, you're actually going to see these fruit laying on the ground next to the plant. Sometimes what you'll see is if you have a stress period and then you add water either through rain or irrigation later on, you can see this recovery period where it goes up, it starts to drop off dramatically, you get some water, and then it tries to recover over the course of the season. I was making some changes to this morning, and I made up a really cool graph for the early irrigation, and then I grabbed the wrong version of the presentation. So I will just tell you, on the early irrigation, we did not see any major effect on the overall yield or bowl distribution when compared to the other later irrigation systems, which told us, first of all, if you are going to be saving some water, and this makes sense in terms of the potential of evapotranspiration, you don't want to over-irrigate early on in the season. Plants are pretty adaptable. You are going to see some shortening of the plants, but in terms of overall yield, if you're in a production system that has the capability of making 2.5, 3 bales, you're probably not going to see a dramatic loss from under irrigation early in the season. In fact, especially if you're using water to put in fertilizer, to incorporate your yellows, to do some of this. If you're putting in some water in order to do your field management, you can probably get over really trying to push the water early on. And Jim, feel free to correct me, because I want to make sure that I tell this accurately. But if you're going to stress the plant, or if you're going to create a water deficit, it's a lot better to be doing it early in the season, both from a yield and quality standpoint, than it is in the middle or the latter part of the season. As we move into the late season treatments, I thought this was interesting. What happens if you push water late on in the season? And the answer is not much. You see a little bit higher retention. In 2013, you kind of gained by pushing some water late on. But generally speaking, you're only increasing your yield by a little bit. So if you've already passed the time where the plant's fruiting, you're not going to be able to dramatically improve its productivity. Now, if you go low, medium, if you have enough water that you're pushing water when you get into flowering, you can do quite a bit of recovery on that. In fact, as you increase the irrigation toward the middle and latter part of the season, you can get yields that are very similar to that unstressed curve that we were showing you before. If you go, low and then high irrigation, we're locked into almost an identical fruiting pattern of what we get if we push the water hot and heavy throughout the entire season. During the middle of the season, if you cut off the water in the middle of the season, almost every one of these is showing a pretty dramatic drop off right here in the middle of the plant, and that showed up in the yield as well. It hurt us in terms of fiber quality, but primarily if you cut off the water completely, it hurt us a lot more in terms of fiber quality than if we just had a relatively low amount of water. In terms of fiber quality, this was up north, and so the micromer numbers were a little bit immature, which is more common as you get up further north. But I'd like to point out our period 1 irrigation had pretty much no effect on fiber quality. We had one spot right here where it showed up as being significant, but for the most part, across the board, fiber quality was about unchanged in terms of the irrigation that you put on early in the season. In the middle of the season, as long as you stayed away from this dry land, you're in pretty good shape. If you cut off the water completely, the plants really suffered, and that showed up in the fiber quality. But other than that, the fiber quality was relatively stable. However, when we moved into the third period, fiber quality just completely got destroyed, and it followed the pattern just like we would, in fact, it was almost, too perfect to be true in terms of it followed the pattern to the T in terms of if you decreased the water a little bit too soon, you lost fiber quality. And it makes sense, if you have a lot of bowls that are being water stressed, they're going to suffer. And that showed up in our fiber quality. A few things. If you have enough water to maintain the plant up until squaring, you really don't want to over push the water early on. The middle of the season is extremely sensitive to water stress, and if you have a limited amount of water that you're trying to use in a year, it's a lot better to be using it in the middle and latter part of the season. Otherwise, you're going to run into a lot of problems with yield and fiber quality. And then early in the season, you're going to need to expect the plants to be shorter if they undergo water deficit stress at that point. But amazingly enough, they are still going to put on quite a bit of fruit if they have enough water in the middle or latter part of the season. Your fiber quality can be impacted in the middle of the season if you have really severe stress. But late in the season, and when I say late in the season, I would say, we're probably talking about, the last, what would you say, Jim, about the last 3 weeks of flowering? And even, maybe the last 2 weeks of flowering leading into the first week of cutout. It's, those of you who worked with cotton, you realize when we say cut out, there are still some flowers being produced over time, but we're past the main flowers.
It really depends on how much water you got in the profile. Like, see.
Yeah, it depends on how much water you have in the profile late in the season. Just be aware that those plants are still going to be utilizing a little bit of water, and you need to have enough to kind of take it past the point where, the fruit are going to be stressed in terms of bulb development. All right, if you're going to cut off the water, cut it off early. Are there any questions?
What you just said, you're going to cut the water off, cut it off early? Is that
Sorry?
what your last study? You're going to cut